Well, I'm a mystery to everybody. Not many believe I exist.
We all know what he's contributed here to our field and our endeavor, and it's immense and that very valuable, and it's something that we appreciate greatly. And Jeff continues to be at the forefront of following up on the latest and best evidence, and I think this lecture will show just how what we indeed are going towards, I think, in the future of Sasquatch research. Okay. Jeff Meldrum.
So before I get started, kudos for a fantastic event. I mean, as always, Tom just really makes such a personal experience enjoyable, and it's been great. Those of you that were here yesterday, we had a fantastic evening, and it's really fun for me to reconnect. And thank you for your patience as I'm rattling through those little file cards, trying to remember where I've seen you before, because it's getting harder and harder. I've met so many wonderful people, and you've all shared so many interesting experiences. All right, you don't have to take notes, which means I'm going to talk fast, because the most challenging thing to do these anymore is to decide what to talk about, what not to talk about in this time only 50 minutes, and if I keep it under 50 minutes, we'll be lucky. But I hope you'll find it worthwhile. So fasten your seatbelt and let's get started. What I'd like to do is to begin by considering a much broader context of where we can put this phenomenon. A lot of times, and I'm sure John will agree, because he's dealt a lot with the philosophical aspects of the progress of science. And a lot of times, if there isn't a paradigm to accommodate a new idea, then it meets with tremendous resistance from the established scientific community. And so I've been working really, really hard these past few years to try to carve, not to carve out, but to, I mean, the opening is there, and to anyone that will consider it, it's there. But things have begun to happen, to accumulate, that are creating a broader context for the Sasquatch phenomenon that makes it absolutely rational and expected within the anthropological discipline. So when we talk about, and that's this notion of a relict hominoid. So when we say hominoid, what do we mean? Well, hominoid makes reference to members of the superfamily Hominoidea, which encompasses humans and the apes, both great and lesser. There are other terms that you may have encountered that fall within the finer gradations of that Linnaean taxonomic hierarchy. Like you've probably heard the terms hominid, and now more recently hominin, which, as we've applied more strict cladistic methods, a system of classification, have drawn more particular attention to our, let me find that right button. This one's a little different than the last one I've used. Which one's the pointer? Is it right or left? Right in, oh, there we go, okay. So, drawing greater attention to our close relationship to the chimpanzees in particular, we now have a subfamily Homininae, and when we say hominins, we're referring to those members, those ancestors and close relatives since the divergence from that last common ancestor with the chimpanzee. So I think you'll recognize all these various representatives of their genera here. Recognize that, Phil? Yeah. Okay. But before we had this modern concept of primates, if we spread the net even further than hominoids to include the Old World and New World monkeys, as well as the prosimians, the lorises, the galagos, the tarsiers, and so on. Linnaeus had proposed a group, a taxon, called the anthropomorpha. We break that down, that's the man-shaped creatures. And this was published clear back in 1763, and it was quite interesting because even though there's some artistic interpretation, the walking sticks, that's a tool, an artistic representation of the fact that these creatures weren't very stable on their hind legs. They didn't walk very well bipedally like we do. Not that they walked around using a stick. But many of the details, some of the facial features, particularly the feet, I'm focusing on that. But the artist has captured the essence of an orangutan versus a chimpanzee foot and a baboon foot. We can see an orangutan, a chimp, and even here a gelada baboon, a female gelada baboon, even though the face is quite anthropomorphized there. He even got the details of this little looks like a necklace around her chest there. Well, and in fact, the female geladas have a bare chest that's adorned with a series of little vesicles, which during estrus become tumescent. Looks like a little pearl necklace. So he caught that detail. But Linnaeus also described the troglodyte. This was a hirsute, a hairy, speechless, mute, nocturnal creature that was said to inhabit these, the far corners of the globe. And many just dismissed it as, some derogatory depiction of some ethnic group, perhaps. But the notion that there were man-shaped creatures was quite readily accepted because they were anticipated. They filled in that apparent gap between us and the barnyard animals. And we'll see why that was important. But there wasn't except for those in this room, a recognized candidate to represent that particular group. So Linnaeus, in standardizing this concept of the troglodyte, he made the important distinction to other Homo, other humans, Homo sapiens. In fact, Homo sapiens means the wise man or the wise ones, and that always kind of struck me. That's rather egotistical to. Sure, we pride ourselves in being rational and being intelligent in comparison to the animal kingdom. But really, it wasn't so much about that as it was the very close distinction between these two species of humans. He saw this as another type of human. Now, do you recognize that figure? Where is that from? The Voyager. Did you ever wonder who posed for that picture? Oh, come on. Charlton Heston's co-star, Nova, on Planet of the Apes. Isn't that pretty amazing? It was just coincidental. I already found that, but thought that was interesting. All right. Now, not everyone accepted or found this notion of a troglodyte as having a basis in science. One of the most vocal art critics was an anthropologist by the name of Blumenbach, a zoologist, a naturalist. Anthropology as a discipline hadn't really taken form yet. But he was quite influential. He was the first to formalize the description of chimpanzees. He argued that this was Linnaeus's great mistake, the notion of a troglodyte, of Homo troglodytes, and he figured that it was just a confused description mixing the traits of orangutans and humans from Southeast Asia. Now, mixing it just in a descriptive way, not in a genomic way, as some people these days would have it. So this plus sign is only for characteristics, not for genes. Okay, keep that very, very clear. All right, he argued that, actually, Linnaeus did abandon the term anthropomorpha and began about 20 years later. The Systema Natura then was published with the term primates, the first ones, the primary ones. And within the primates, Blumenbach recognized two genera. The genus Homo, with troglodytes gone. In fact, he took troglodytes and hooked it up with pan to make the scientific term for the chimpanzee, for Pan-troglodytes. Now this figure, I've still not quite figured it out yet, because both these figures in other sources have been labeled as chimpanzees. This one labels this one as an orangutan, but it more clearly depicts a chimpanzee. The limb proportions and the long digits on this one suggest that it's an orangutan. So even back then, as they were sorting out these taxonomies and these descriptions, there was often a bit of confusion. These were new, these were interesting. Now, as I said, the notion that there would be such creatures wasn't unanticipated. I mean, it was expected. Natural theologians who were out there studying nature were doing so to better understand the Creator. We understand the Creator by knowing more intimately the creation. And if the Creator is perfect, if the creation is therefore perfect, it will be perfect in the expression of its completeness. And so we should have this imperceptible gradation from the simplest organisms to the most complex and sublime. And of course humans are just a little lower than the angels. So here we are, and then right there the angels, plucking their harps and singing praises, and they're the gods, gods, he, she, whatever persuasion you may adhere to. Okay. This was called the scale of nature, or it was also referred to as the great chain of being. That analogy to a chain is where the expression missing links first came about. So missing links were those forms that would fill the gap, especially this dramatic void between us and even some of these anthropomorphic creatures. Okay, but then we have the formalization of evolutionary biology through the work of Darwin in 1859. The Origin of Species was published, but in one of his notebooks, Darwin drew this figure with this little notation. I think this, and instead of a great chain of being or a scale, he saw nature as a series of ramifying branches diverging from ancestors to offspring or to descendant species. And eventually, when he published his Origin of Species, the only figure he included in the entire book was this one. It was such a fundamental shift in thinking of evolution or of biology, in biology at that time, that it was the only one that was reinforced with this figure, a series of branching lineages, many of which went extinct without further issue. That was contrary to the general idea of things. I mean, well, things we see today, it was thought were just the way they were, essentially, is when they were stamped with the Creator's stamp in the Garden of Eden there, named by Adam. Okay, so we had this shift in idea. This notion of the great chain of being gave way to a phylogeny, a family tree. And missing links were no longer links in this great chain of being, but they represented these intermediate forms and these shared common ancestors. So there wasn't a series of independent special creations. There was descent with modification from pre-existing ancestors. All right, now, with that little primer on the notion of how evolutionary phylogeny and classification came into being, anthropology in about the 1960s and 70s. See, right about the time a lot of the stories of Bigfoot were in their heyday, a couple of anthropologists at the University of Michigan borrowed a much talked about principle in general evolutionary biology called the principle of competitive exclusion. As ecology was taking shape alongside evolution, the notion of a niche was catching on and was taking shape and being developed. And this niche was the kind of the exclusive, just the way a species would make a living and the parameters that defined that. And a species was adapted, was quite evolved to fill that particular niche. And two species couldn't share that because there would always be one that did it a little bit better than the other. And Gauss, who worked with microorganisms, recognizes if you grew these two species of protists, these little one-celled organisms, separately, they did just fine in very similar conditions. But if you grew them together in the same niche, or the same medium, this Paramecium aurelia would start off kind of slow, but then it got the upper hand and it became the dominant species and drove Caudatum to extinction every time. So he called this the principle of competitive exclusion. So these anthropologists borrowed that or took that notion and said, well, that must apply. I mean, human ancestors are animal species like any other. And so, if we define the hominid niche, and this is a pretty simplistic definition, but that's what it really boils down to, bipedal and brainy, and then the things that go with that. There could be only one species in that niche at any one time. So the evolution of hominids, or now we'd say hominins, since the divergence from that last common ancestor shared with chimpanzees, it was seen as a series, a succession of just one species at a time. In fact, some would say, we don't even really need to call these different species. Everything back to there we can just call Homo sapiens. It's just different forms of human. And that was kind of chic for a while, but I mean, that dilutes any definitions and understanding of adaptations of any of the populations along the way. But so while depictions like this, how many of you have that book on your shelf? Anybody recognize this? You know, a few of you. This was back before the age of the internet and all the graphics that are available there. I mean, this was where I learned about human evolution when I was a youngster, and this big fold out here. You know, when you have this kind of graphic, you're kind of constrained as you're trying to depict something that progresses through time. You end up kind of doing it in a linear fashion. It's easy to depict it that way. Sometimes that draws some criticism, but the problem with that is this single species hypothesis really interpreted the evolution as occurring like this. That one species would go extinct as its successor replaced it. There weren't any coexisting at the same time. There could be only one. That's the theme of a movie, isn't it? Remember that? Movie trivia? Highlander, very good. You're on top of there. Okay. Well, this started to fall apart as the fossil record for hominids began to grow. And here's a depiction of not Louis Leakey, that was his father, Richard Leakey, pointing out that fossils of at least 4 different species of hominid were coexisting at the same time in East Africa, about about 2 million years ago, 1.5 to 2 million years ago. This is a robust form. This is actually, sometimes it's referred to as Australopithecus boisei, the East African form. Or to make that distinction even more obvious, it was called Paranthropus, parallel to man. And then by this time we've got a pretty brainy hominid, Homo erectus, or the African form became known now as, or is now known as Homo ergaster. This is Homo rudolfensis and Homo habilis. And so one of these may have even been originally the ancestor of Homo ergaster, but didn't go extinct. I mean, you have that split. You don't have to drive the one species to extinction if they can displace their characteristics enough that they can occupy slightly different niches. You know, maybe there is more than one way to be a hominid, in other words. Okay. So here's a close-up of that, so you can see the beautiful skulls. And notice the difference, notice the distinction here between the Homo and the Paranthropus. You know, we've got this larger brain, we don't have any sign of a sagittal crest, the face is getting a little smaller, and the teeth are smaller, because with those brains they're using stone tools, they're making tools, they have other technologies to assist them. Whereas this thing, it took a different path. Brain, you know, not much bigger than a gorilla or chimpanzee, but look at that deep face, and if we turned it over, the teeth are huge. They're gigantic compared to those of the other hominids. So they're chewing their way through. One of my professors called them that they were the Cuisinart of hominids. And so we could envision scenes like this. I mean, this was already in that same Time Life Nature book, showing early Homo wielding their pebble tools, confronting a band of Paranthropus, heaving rocks. Common behavior, right? All right, well, things haven't changed much. Oops, keep pushing the wrong button. It's just that the weapons have changed a little bit. But, you know, that scene wasn't so unusual to think about. We have not another hominid, but we have another primate, another hominoid living side by side with us. Well, as the fossil record began to grow, not only were there instances of a few hominids side by side, but now that, I mean, there are times when there were as many as 6 or 8. And if you recognize, as has been acknowledged by many researchers who have compared the taxonomic diversity in some of these paleo communities with modern communities of primates and lots of other mammals to get a handle on how spotty is the fossil record, some estimates suggest that our fossil record only reveals about 8% of the species that existed in the past. 8%. Now maybe hominids are a little more conservative than that, but even if it was just half, this could represent just half of the diversity. There might not have been 4 or 6, there might have been 10 or 12 different species across the globe in different places. Now most of these are centered in Eurasia, obviously, in East Africa, South Africa, and places where the fossil record is capricious. So many, many different types of hominids coexisting. All right. Now, in addition to the bushiness of that hominid family tree, recent evidence has also suggested that many of those lineages, those contemporary lineages, have persisted until much more recently than has ever been recognized before. This was really driven home with the discovery of Homo floresiensis, the hobbit, on the island of Flores down in Indonesia. And a little diminutive of hominid, different depictions. You know, here's the one when they were trying to suggest or to justify that it was a dwarfed Homo erectus, because what else could it be? I mean, that's the only other hominid that's around. So it was an island dwarf population specific to the island of Flores. But others said, well, gee, maybe it was. I mean, because when I was asked to review the paper that described the postcranial skeleton for a journal, and as I looked at it, first of all, how do you call it Homo? It has a brain that's smaller than a chimpanzee's. Tiny. There was a paper published in Tandem arguing for the association of some very crude stone tools and some controlled use of fire. If you read that paper, it's a very shaky argument, not convincing at all, that this creature had controlled use of fire rather than this was just charcoal that we not in a structured hearth, but on the floor of the cave due to fire. The postcranial skeleton looks remarkably primitive. It looks like one of those Australopithecines. And now all of a sudden the means are saying, well, this could be a relic Australopithecine that has made its way all the way to Southeast Asia. You know, it's a species, related species that could be 3 million years old. Of course, Cliff Barackman has been collecting, assembling footprints that may come from this thing. The foot is kind of interesting. It has these long lateral digits and it has a very short hallux. So it would not look like our foot at all. And the foot length relative to the leg length is more like a chimpanzee. This thing was probably climbing in trees. All right. Now, on the island of Flores, in central Flores, the native people refer to this as the Ibugogo. That's their name for it. And they claim that 200 years ago, they finally got fed up with these very aggressive, ornery little hominids and decided to extirpate the remaining ones, herd them into a cave, piled up the brush in front of it, lit it afire, killed them all. The remaining, however many, I don't know what the tradition says, but one of the interesting projects I'm involved with is we're seeking permission to excavate that very cave. So we're going over, we've got the funding to go over next spring to do a liaison trip and meet with the Ministry of Antiquities and the academics over there, and then go to Flores with them, meet with the headman, and survey the site and see if we can get permission. So can you imagine the impact, the repercussions if we walk out with a 200-year-old Ibugogo skeleton? So, although it's interesting because this discovery was made literally the week, 3 days before I was giving a promotion seminar in what turned out to be a failed bid for a promotion to full professor. And I thought, you know, how could they not, after seeing this and all the discussions, the conversation about this, you know, just completely oblivious to the significance of it. And so anyway, But not everyone. Henry Guy is one of the managing editors of Nature magazine, which I hope you'll recognize as one of the flagship multidisciplinary science journals in England. And he wrote a very interesting paper called Flores, God, and Cryptozoology. I'd recommend you look it up. And he said, the discovery that Homo floresiensis survived until so very recently in geologic terms makes it more likely that stories of other mythical human-like creatures, such as Yetis, are founded on grains of truth. And I even used almost that same slide in this presentation. It's like that Jeff Dunbar peanut. Anyway, but it wasn't lost on everyone. Chris Stringer is one of the preeminent paleoanthropologists of our generation, holds a position at the British Museum of Natural History. And he said, too, during that interview with Henry Guy, he said, one of the first things I thought of on learning about the Flores skeleton was a possible parallel with the orangutan pandemic. I had the privilege of going to China on a separate trip, not the one to look for the Yeren, but I was working, trying to develop a collaboration with Dr. Liu over here, who had custody of a remarkable skeleton that he excavated just north of Beijing. Its date dates to about 12 to 20,000 years ago. Say that again, 12 to 20,000 years ago. 12,000 to 20,000, but 12,000, I mean, and this is an extremely robust skeleton. Look at that profile. It looks like a Neanderthal, except it doesn't have the highly derived features, the inflated maxilla and so forth, some of the other traits that distinguish Neanderthals from their immediate predecessors, Homo heidelbergensis. Thick cortical bones. I mean, this thing was robust, very robust. Modern Homo sapiens were already in the neighborhood for 50,000 years. So they were living side by side. For 50,000 years, there were other hominids on the block. You know, there goes the neighborhood. They were probably saying that, like, Homo sapiens, right? There goes the neighborhood. So if we consider the Asian hominoids, there's Homo floresiensis, 18 to 13,000. There were some early reports of 13, and then some more later dating kind of pushed that back to, but still 18. We have Homo erectus on some of the isolated islands like Java that are down close to 27 to 35,000 years ago. This specimen of Homo heidelbergensis, 12,000 years ago, we just looked at. Recently, there was the description of a new site of Neanderthal that's only 10,000 based on preliminary dates. 10,000 years, that's almost into historic times. And then Homo sapiens, and then we have the Denisovans, which is quite interesting. 20 to 30,000 years, the most recent specimens of those. And then there was this new population, the Red Deer Cave in southern China, where the crania were quite distinct, and the author stopped just short of erecting a new taxon to accommodate them, but pointed out that this was a distinct population. There was restricted gene flow probably, in order for them to have evolved these different characteristics. And then we have these other, since hominoids also includes apes, of course we have Gigantopithecus, which is acknowledged to have persisted to at least 300,000 years, and in some texts you'll see the figure 200,000 years dropped. And then what was really interesting, teeth that were previously attributed to Homo erectus, that were contemporaneous with Gigantopithecus, found in these karst caves, have now been attributed to Lufengpithecus, which was a gorilla-sized ape. But the real significance of that is that here's another species that has persisted well into the Pleistocene. Well into the Pleistocene, into a time when most of the other apes were extinct, as we'll see in just a moment. But still, we see titles of books like this, Lone Survivors, How We Came to Be the Only Humans on Earth, or the only hominids. He's using the word humans quite liberally in this instance. Nova had a series called Becoming Human. The last episode was entitled The Last Human Standing. The previous episodes emphasized this notion of multiplicity of species in the past, and then posed the question, so why are we the only hominids on the planet? Well, are we? That's the whole why. And why do we keep assuming that in the face of so much evidence to the contrary? And it keeps building, and it keeps building. And that's So we're getting to the point where it's starting to get a little traction.